The temple doors are about to close for 400 years, and no one inside knows it yet. Smoke curls from the altar. The priests move through rituals they've performed 1,000 times. It feels like any other day. It is not, because after this, there will be no more prophets, no more visions in the night, no more voice thundering from a mountain. Just silence, stretching across 16 generations, until a child is born in a stable in Bethlehem 400 years later. So what did God say right before he stopped talking? His final words are sitting in the last book of the Old Testament, spoken through a man history barely remembers, no family history, no hometown. Some scholars aren't even sure his name was really a name at all, because in Hebrew it simply means my messenger. And 24 centuries later, his warning reads, like it was written about us, the same leftovers on the altar, the same empty motions every week, the same hearts, technically present, actually somewhere else. Maybe God didn't go silent. Maybe we just stopped listening. This is Malachi, the last voice before the silence fell. The last voice. Before 400 years of silence, the shocking final warning of Malachi. He has no genealogy, no hometown, no family line, no dramatic calling story like Isaiah collapsing before a vision of God on his throne, or Jeremiah told he was chosen before he was even born, or Ezekiel swallowing a scroll and speaking life into a valley of dry bones. Just a name and a message. Maybe that silence about the man isn't an accident. Maybe it's the point. This was never meant to be a story about making a prophet famous. It was about delivering God's last words before 4 centuries of silence fell like a curtain. So picture the moment right before that curtain drops. You are born the year your people finally walk back into Jerusalem after 70 years of exile in Babylon. Your first memory of home is rubble, collapsed walls, a burned shell where the temple used to stand, and still your parents tell you, this is only the beginning. For a while it looks like they're right. Under Zerubbabel, a new temple rises from the ashes, smaller than Solomon's, plainer, but standing. Under Nehemiah, walls that had lain broken for generations go back up in 52 days. 52. Under Ezra, the law is placed back at the center of everyday life. You grow up believing the glory is coming back, that the Messiah is close, that soon the nations themselves will stream toward this rebuilt city just to meet your God. Now fast forward, it's nearly 100 years later. You are gone. It's your grandchildren standing where you once stood, and nothing they were promised has happened. No Messiah walked through the gates. No nation ever came to learn of God. No fire fell from heaven to consume the sacrifice, the way it did the day Solomon dedicated his temple. No glory filled this building, the way it once filled the old one. Your grandchildren are still paying taxes to a Persian king, still ruled by a governor they never chose, in a province so small that historians estimate its entire population numbered only in the tens of thousands. Drought comes. Crops fail. Life is hard, and it doesn't get easier. So how long can a people keep believing in a promise that keeps not arriving? Something starts to rot. Quietly, the way rust spreads across iron invisible, until the whole structure is already weak. It starts with the priests. The men trained to guard God's law start taking bribes to look away from sin. They teach whatever pays, not whatever is true. And then they cross a line that should have been unthinkable. They start accepting sick, blind, and lame animals for sacrifice, the exact thing Leviticus and Deuteronomy explicitly forbid, in writing for centuries. If you'd been standing in that courtyard and watched a priest wave through a crippled lamb like it was nothing, would you have said something or gone quiet like everyone else? Because the people did go quiet, and they learned the lesson perfectly. Soon families are bringing their worst animals to God's altar instead of their best. The sick sheep nobody wanted, the lame goat that couldn't be sold, the blind cow with no value left in it. They hand it over, call it worship, and go home satisfied. Marriages start breaking too. Men look at the wives who survived exile and rebuilding beside them and trade them in for something newer, younger, more attractive pagan women. Better connected, better for business. If you were the wife who'd stayed loyal through 70 years of hardship, only to be discarded for someone's better opportunity, what would that betrayal feel like, dressed up as a personal choice? The tithes stop next. The temple storehouse runs dry, because people start telling themselves, God doesn't need my money as badly as I do. He owns the whole earth. I have bills to pay. He'll understand. And the marketplace conversations turn bitter. What's even the point of obeying God? Look at everyone else. They lie, they cheat, they worship whatever they want, and they're doing just fine. We follow the rules, and we can barely survive. Where's the reward in that? If that was the only conversation you ever heard, at every dinner table, your entire life, would obedience still mean anything to you by the time you were grown? By the time Malachi finally appears, an entire generation has been raised on exactly that logic. They still know every ritual. They still show up for every festival, every sacrifice, every appointed day. Their hearts are somewhere else completely. And God has been watching every bit of it. The bribes, the crippled animals, the broken marriages, the empty storehouse, the bitter conversations in the marketplace. For 100 years he says nothing at all. Then he finally breaks the silence, one last time, in a way he had never spoken through a prophet before. No throne room vision like Isaiah's, no living symbol like Hosea marrying a prostitute, or Jeremiah walking around wearing a wooden yoke. No scroll to eat, no valley of dry bones to speak over, the way Ezekiel once did. Instead, God does something almost unbearably direct. He starts a conversation, and he doesn't sound like a patient father gently pleading with confused children. He sounds like a prosecutor who already has every piece of evidence, calling his witnesses to the stand one final time. He makes an accusation. The people fire back immediately, defensive, almost offended. What do you mean? What have we ever done? And God answers with proof. That pattern repeats again and again through the entire book, and underneath it sits something far more disturbing than any single sin on that list. By now, these people no longer recognize themselves as sinners at all. By the time Malachi opens his mouth, God has stopped preaching. He starts prosecuting. 5 times in this one short book, the same pattern plays out. God makes an accusation. The people respond, insulted, defensive, demanding proof. And God answers with evidence so specific, there's nowhere left to hide. Picture it like an actual trial. The whole nation gathered. One obscure prophet reading the charges out loud, one by one, on God's behalf. Charge 1. Contempt for his love. It opens almost tenderly. I have loved you, God says. 3 words that should have dropped an entire nation to its knees. Instead, how have you loved us? Not thank you. Not we remember. Just prove it. Would you dare say that to the one who pulled your ancestors out of slavery, dragged you back from 70 years of exile, and could have left you scattered across the earth forever but didn't? God's answer is loaded. I love Jacob, he says, then without softening it at all, but Esau I hated. That single line would go on to become one of the most fought-over sentences in the entire Bible, quoted centuries later by the Apostle Paul, still debated by theologians today. But here, in this moment, the point is simple. God never chose this people because they deserved it. He chose them out of raw, undeserved love. And their answer to that love was a shrug. Charge 2. Contempt for his name. Now God turns to the priests directly. And this time the word he chooses isn't careless or disappointing. It's despise. A son honors his father. A servant respects his master. God says, "So where is my honor? Where is my fear? How have we despised your name?" They ask back, and the disturbing part is, they don't sound like they're lying. They sound like they genuinely have no idea. So God spells it out. You bring me blind animals, lame ones, sick ones, and you call that a sacrifice. Then he sets up a scene that cuts right to the point. Take that same crippled animal, he says, and walk it over to the governor's palace instead. Offer it to him as a gift. Tell him it's a sign of honor. Try it. Every priest standing there knows exactly what would happen. Thrown out, beaten by the guards, publicly humiliated, never allowed back. Nobody insults a Persian governor with garbage and calls it a gift. So here's what hangs in the air, unanswered. If you'd never dare treat a foreign official that way, what does it say that you treat the creator of the universe like that every single week without a second thought? Behind it was simple math. A healthy lamb sold for real silver in the marketplace. A blind, dying one sold for nothing. So why burn a good animal on God's altar when he, being God, would just have to accept the leftovers anyway? Charge 3. Betrayal of covenant. The scene shifts. This time it's not the priests. It's the husbands. God says the altar itself is drowning in tears, the tears of wives watching their marriages get thrown away. Here's what makes this one sting even harder. Just one generation earlier, under Ezra, Israelite men had been ordered to divorce the foreign wives they'd married to protect the covenant from corruption. It was brutal. It tore families apart. And it worked. For a while. Now, one generation later, their own sons are doing the exact opposite, divorcing the Jewish wives who stood beside them through exile, through rubble, through years of rebuilding, trading them in for younger, wealthier, better connected pagan women instead. She rebuilt a life from nothing, next to that man, for 20 or 30 years. Then one day, he simply walked away for something better. What would you call that, if not betrayal? I hate divorce, God says. Not the people caught inside one. The act itself, the casual, careless destruction of a promise that was never supposed to be breakable. And here's the part that makes it worse than an ordinary broken promise. In Israel, marriage wasn't only marriage, it was a living picture of God's own covenant with his people. So every time a man discarded his wife, the moment something more convenient came along, he was accidentally confessing exactly how he saw his relationship with God too, replaceable, the second it stopped being useful. Charge 4. Theft. Will a man rob God? Comes the accusation. Yet you are robbing me. Same reflex as always. How? How exactly are we robbing you? In your tithes. This wasn't a suggestion. It was law. 10% of everything, every harvest, every animal, every bit of increase, belonged in the temple storehouse. That money didn't just vanish into ceremony. It fed the priests and Levites who served full-time and owned no land of their own. It supported widows, orphans, and foreigners who had nowhere else to turn. It kept the entire house of God running, and the people had simply stopped bringing it. Picture a priest's household going hungry, not because the harvest failed, but because everyone around them quietly decided God could wait. It wasn't hypothetical. Nehemiah, governing this very city around this same period, once came back from a trip abroad to find the Levites had abandoned the temple altogether and gone back to farming, just to survive. Meanwhile, the people who'd kept that missing 10% were spending it on their own houses, their own comfort, then wondering out loud why God's blessing had dried up along with the rain. "You are cursed with a curse," God tells them. Not one person, the whole nation, for robbing him, and somehow not even realizing it. Charge 5. Slander. The final charge isn't about an action at all. It's about words, ordinary conversations, traded in marketplaces and around dinner tables, by people who assumed no one important was listening. "Your words have been harsh against me," God says. "What have we even said?" they ask again, completely blindsided. So God quotes them back to themselves, word for word. "It is vain to serve God," they'd said. "What's the profit in keeping his commands, in walking around like we're in mourning over it? Now we call the arrogant blessed. Evildoers do whatever they want, and it costs them nothing." Sit with that for a second. This wasn't outsiders mocking the faith from a distance. This was God's own people, talking about their own God, at their own tables, raised on nothing but that kind of talk, every conversation, every complaint, every dinner. Would you have grown up believing any differently than they did? 5 charges, 5 denials, 5 pieces of evidence that leave nothing left to argue. And underneath every single one sits the exact same root problem. They had forgotten who they were even dealing with. His holiness reduced to background noise, his patience mistaken for weakness, his long silence mistaken for indifference, maybe even for absence. After centuries of holding back, God was finally ready to say it, enough. A good doctor never stops at the diagnosis. Malachi has just handed down 5 of the harshest diagnoses in the Old Testament. Contempt disguised as worship. Priests who despise God's own name. Marriages discarded for something better. Money stolen straight from the temple storehouse. Words so bitter, God quotes them back, word for word. Any one of those alone could end a relationship for good, but a diagnosis without a prescription is just cruelty. And buried inside this book's harshest chapter is something nobody in that room expected. A treatment plan. Chapter 3 opens with a promise. "Behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me." Then something bigger. The Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. Someone is coming first. Then, without warning, the Lord himself walks in. The next title God uses appears nowhere else in the entire Old Testament, not once. Before this or after it. The messenger of the covenant. A phrase this book had to invent, because nothing else in Scripture had ever needed it. Many scholars trace this straight to 2 people who wouldn't be born for another 400 years. John the Baptist and Jesus Christ. Exactly how remains debated. What the text makes unmistakably clear is that someone is coming, and the silence is almost here, except read the very next line, and the relief drains right out of the room. Who can endure the day of his coming? Who can stand when he appears? Because this isn't only rescue. He is like a refiner's fire, and like fuller's soap. Neither of those was gentle. A refiner didn't wash silver. He burned it again and again, at heat close to 1,000 degrees Celsius, until every trace of impurity rose to the surface and could be scraped away. A fuller didn't use bar soap. He used a harsh alkaline compound, similar to lye, strong enough to strip raw wool clean of grease, and dirt caustic, enough to burn skin if it sat too long. That's the image God chooses for his own arrival. Not a gentle knock at the door. A fire hot enough to show exactly what you're made of. If that fire walked into your life this week and burned away everything false in it, what would actually be left standing? For some in that room, that question was terrifying. But later in this same message, one more promise flips the entire picture. For you who fear my name, the Son of Righteousness shall rise. With healing in its wings, you shall go out leaping, like calves released from the stall. Same fire. Same coming day. But for those who hadn't gone numb, who hadn't turned worship into a chore, it wasn't judgment waiting on the other side. It was sunrise after the longest winter of their lives, healing folded into the light itself. Imagine spending years going through motions you no longer felt anything for, still showing up anyway, still trying, and then being told that what's coming isn't punishment for you. It's morning. One promise is left, and it's the very last sentence God speaks in the entire Old Testament. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes, and he will turn the hearts of fathers to their children, and the hearts of children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the land with a decree of utter destruction. Centuries later, Jesus himself pointed back to this exact verse in Matthew chapter 11. Other scholars read it differently, but look closely at what's actually being promised here. Not wealth, not victory over enemies, not even the temple restored to Solomon's old glory. Hearts. Fathers and children turned back toward each other before it's too late to matter. That promise never faded. To this day, at every Passover meal, Jewish families around the world still set an empty chair at the table and pour a cup no one drinks. Someone opens the door, just in case. All of it for a guest promised in this exact verse, 24 centuries ago. If you'd been sitting at that table the first time this promise was spoken, would you have believed it? Or would you have assumed, like everyone around you probably did, that this was just one more promise God would never get around to keeping? Fire and healing, judgment and rescue, standing side by side in the last words God would speak for 400 years. And then, right after saying it, heaven goes silent. The house lights go down. Malachi finishes speaking. The last sentence of the Old Testament settles into silence, and unlike every pause before it, this one never lifts. No prophet takes the stage next. No vision in the night. No fire on a mountain. No voice out of a whirlwind. Just nothing. 1 year of silence becomes 10. 10 becomes 50. 50 becomes 100. 100 becomes 200. 200 becomes 400. 16 generations are born, grow old, and die inside that silence. Not one of them hears a single new word from God. Grandfathers tell grandsons about a promise none of them were ever around to see kept. How many mornings would you keep waking up expecting a prophet's voice before you simply stopped expecting it at all? Backstage, the set keeps changing. Here's what almost no one sitting in the dark could see happening. While heaven says nothing, empires keep talking, loudly, violently, one after another. Persia, the power ruling when Malachi first spoke, collapses to a 20-something conqueror named Alexander the Great, who tears through the entire region in barely a decade. Greek becomes the language spoken from Athens to the edge of India. Then Alexander dies at 32. and his own generals carve up the empire between them. For nearly a century, Judea belongs to the Ptolemies, the Greek dynasty ruling out of Egypt. Then the Seleucids, ruling out of Syria, take it by force instead. One Seleucid king, Antiochus IV, does something no conqueror before him had dared. He marches into the temple in Jerusalem and has a pig slaughtered on the altar itself. He outlaws the Sabbath, outlaws circumcision, outlaws the Torah, on penalty of death. If soldiers desecrated the one place your people considered untouchably holy and dared you to do something about it, would you have risked your life fighting back, knowing you were almost certainly going to lose? A priest named Mattathias and his sons do exactly that. Their revolt against an empire somehow wins. For the first time in centuries, Judea tastes independence. Under a new ruling family, the Hasmoneans. It doesn't last. Rome comes next. A general named Pompey marches into Jerusalem in 63 BC and does something even Antiochus never dared. He walks straight into the Holy of Holies, the one chamber on earth only Israel's high priest was ever allowed to enter, and only once a year. Scripture had always warned that Rome could kill an unworthy man who entered it. Pompey walks in, looks around, and walks back out, alive. If you'd watched a foreign general survive stepping into the most forbidden room on earth, what would you have made of that silence? Proof God had truly left, or something else entirely. Meanwhile, unnoticed, the props are being built. Here's what nobody watching could have guessed. Every one of these disasters is quietly assembling something. Alexander's conquest doesn't just spread soldiers, it spreads the Greek language so completely that scholars in Alexandria eventually translate the entire Hebrew Bible into it, a project historians call the Septuagint. A conqueror's language becomes the language. An entire future faith will be written in Rome's roads. Engineering marvels stretching across 3 continents aren't built to help preachers travel faster. They're built for tax collectors and legions. But the peace Rome enforces at sword point makes travel safer than it had been in centuries. And in city after city across this new Roman world, exiled Jewish families quietly build synagogues in places that had never had one before, footholds that, one day, something far bigger than any of them could imagine, will need. Nobody sitting inside 400 years of darkness could have seen any of this as a pattern. To them, it just looked like empire after empire, boot after boot. One more decade under foreign rule. Intermission, year 400. By now, an entire nation is starving, not for bread, for a single word from heaven. They're living under Roman soldiers in their own streets. Their own religious leaders have buried God's actual law under mountains of extra rules. And still, somewhere underneath all of it, they're still whispering about a Messiah the prophets promised 4 centuries ago and never took back. Maybe that hunger was the entire point. Maybe 400 years was exactly how long it took to make a people desperate enough to truly listen. The moment a voice finally broke through again. Here's a question worth sitting with. Long after this video ends, what is it costing you right now to keep believing a promise God hasn't spoken about in years? Because silence was never proof that God had left the building. For 400 years, heaven said nothing, and heaven was still working. Somewhere behind that curtain, everything was already being set in place. Silence isn't only the absence of sound. Stretched long enough, it becomes something you can almost feel, like pressure in the air before a storm. For 400 years, that pressure had been building over Israel. Then, on one particular morning in the wilderness southeast of Jerusalem, it broke, not with a whisper, with a shout, loud enough to carry across the desert. The shout, "He doesn't look like a prophet is supposed to look." skin burned dark by the sun, hair uncut, wild, a garment stitched from camel hair, cinched at the waist with a leather belt. Any Israelite standing there that day would have recognized the outfit instantly, because Scripture had described it once before, almost 9 centuries earlier, on a different prophet entirely, Elijah. Even his food fits the pattern. Locusts and wild honey, which sounds like desperation, until you remember, Leviticus explicitly lists certain locusts as clean, permitted food. Even starving in the wilderness, this man breaks no law. He's standing waist-deep in the Jordan, in a stretch of river tradition places near where Elijah himself crossed, centuries earlier, just before being swept up into heaven in a whirlwind. Coincidence? Or an announcement? Because 400 years earlier, in the very last verse God spoke before the silence began, he'd made one final promise. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet, before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. The hunger. People start walking toward him, from Jerusalem, from every town and village in Judea, some for days on foot, into an empty desert, to hear a stranger, dressed like a man who'd been dead for centuries. Why would an entire region drop everything for that? Because it had been 16 generations. Grandparents had died, still waiting for exactly this. A prophet's voice, in the flesh. For the first time in 400 years, he shouts one command, again and again, to everyone wading into the water in front of him: repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Then he baptizes them, calls them to turn from sin, and keeps pointing past himself, towards someone still coming. One is coming after me who is mightier than I am, he tells them. I am not worthy to untie the strap of his sandal. His name is John. The voice. Then, one day, an ordinary-looking man walks down and joins the line. John baptizes him like everyone else who came before him. And the moment he rises out of the water, the sky does something it hasn't done in 400 years. It opens. The Spirit comes down, visible, settling over him like a dove. Then, for the first time in 16 generations, a voice speaks from heaven, loud enough for the whole riverbank to hear. This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. 4 centuries of silence, broken by a single sentence. Aftershock. From that moment, nothing about this man stays ordinary. He gives sight to eyes that have never once seen light. He tells a dead man to get up, and the man gets up. He teaches with an authority that leaves trained religious scholars silent, not quoting other rabbis for approval, the way every teacher before him had, but speaking as if the authority already belonged to him, and he confronts the exact same corruption Malachi confronted 4 centuries earlier, just dressed in new clothes. Inside the temple courtyard, the priests had found a new business model. Roman coins carried Caesar's face, considered unfit to hand over as an offering, so worshippers first had to exchange their money at a counter, at whatever rate the money changers decided to charge that day. Nearby, sellers offered doves. The one sacrificed the law, allowed for families too poor to afford a lamb. 400 years apart, and it's the same sin wearing a different disguise, turning worship into a business, and letting the poorest cover the difference. So Jesus walks into that courtyard and does something no priest, no prophet, had dared to do in 4 centuries. He flips the tables. Coins scatter across the stone floor. He drives the sellers and their animals back out through the gate. My house shall be called a house of prayer, he shouts, but you have made it a den of robbers. Every promise God made in Malachi's final words was suddenly standing in one place, wearing one face, the messenger who prepares the way, the Lord who suddenly comes to his temple, the refiner's fire, walking straight into the one courtyard that most needed to burn clean. 16 generations had waited for exactly this moment. The only question left standing in that courtyard, was whether anyone watching actually recognized what had just walked in. Every mirror tells the truth eventually, even the ones you've learned to angle away from. Malachi's words were addressed to a nation that stopped existing 24 centuries ago. Hold them up against your last 7 days anyway, and look closely. Whose face is actually looking back at you? We call it performance Christianity for a reason. We show up to service. We sing the songs. We post the verse under the photo, wear the shirt with the right words printed across the chest. From a distance, the reflection looks flawless. So here's the question hiding behind it. How many of us have been quietly handing God the sick lamb? Look at where your best hours actually go. Work claims them first. Then whatever survives everything else that felt urgent in the moment: entertainment, scrolling, everyone else's demands. That's what eventually reaches God, if anything does. Not the first hour, the leftover one. Your energy runs the same math. Your own ambitions get you at full strength. God gets whatever's still standing at the end of the day, and we call the leftovers worship anyway. Money follows the identical pattern. Whatever survives your own spending, your own wants, your own emergencies, that's the portion that finally makes it into the offering. Never the first transfer out of the account. Always whatever's left. If anything is, none of that is the healthy lamb from the flock. It's the blind one, the limping one, the one nobody else would buy either. And here's where the mirror actually turns uncomfortable. We still call it enough. One prayer goes unanswered, and suddenly we're questioning whether God even loves us, quietly forgetting the 1,000 prayers he already said yes to. One hard season lands, and we wonder if he's still faithful, standing the entire time in the middle of proof that he has been. That's not a new blindness. It's the exact one Malachi confronted, just dressed differently. We have become the people in his book, spiritually numb to our own condition, defensive, the second. Anyone names it, fully convinced we're already doing enough. Here's what no amount of performance ever gets around. God was never fooled by any of it, then or now. He doesn't grade the outside. He reads hearts, and he knows exactly where the line sits between real devotion and a religious habit worn like a costume, which points to the actual problem. And it isn't a 24-century-old one, it's a permanent one. Left alone, people drift towards spiritual mediocrity every single time. We hand God our leftovers and still expect his best. We go blind to our own blindness and call it faith. No extra effort fixes that from the inside. It needs something from outside of us entirely, which is exactly what the rest of this story turns out to be about. Remember what that courtroom in Malachi actually needed: a sacrifice with no blemish in it anywhere, because every animal they'd offered had something wrong with it. A faithful priest, because every priest they had was for sale. Someone who could finally keep covenant without breaking it, because they broke it every time they tried. They could not produce a single one of those things themselves. So God did what only God could do. After Malachi, 400 years of silence. After Jesus, no further message is coming. Here is God's final word, the complete revelation, the last answer this story is ever going to need. Heaven has spoken. Whether we're listening is a separate question entirely. There's still a day ahead that Malachi described burning like a furnace, consuming every arrogant heart and every evildoer left standing in it. That part hasn't landed yet. We're living instead inside the part that already has. The window Jesus once stood up in a synagogue, unrolled a scroll, and called the favorable year of the Lord grace. Still open, right now, for as long as it lasts. He became the lamb without a single flaw. He became the priest who never once needed a bribe to stay faithful. He kept every line of the covenant we kept breaking. On our behalf, in our place. I have loved you, God told his people. Through a prophet almost nobody remembers. That sentence hasn't expired. It isn't any weaker today than it was 24 centuries ago. Nothing you've done, and nothing you've failed to do, has used it up. But love was never something God forces through a locked door. He confronts. He calls. He keeps knocking. He does not break the door down. So here's the mirror one last time, and this part only you can answer honestly. Your whole self, or just what's left over by the end of the day. Your best, or your leftovers. Do you actually trust his love, or do you keep cross-examining it, standing in the middle of more evidence for it than you could ever finish counting? Israel already answered that question once. They kept the sick lambs coming, kept the excuses coming, kept defending the leftovers as good enough, until they could no longer hear anything back, and heaven went silent. We're the ones answering that same question now. If any part of this found its mark, if you caught your own reflection somewhere in this book, don't just scroll past it. Subscribe if you want more of these stories unpacked like this one. Tap like if something in here actually landed. And down in the comments tell us where you're watching from tonight, or which charge in Malachi's courtroom cut the deepest. Heaven has spoken. The question is still whether we're truly listening. Come home.